Professor Kenneth J teaches modern languages, literatures, and linguistics at the City University of New York. His research interests include Dungan literature and culture, as well as the literatures and cultures of the Tungus people of North Asia, primarily the Udege and Nanai of the Russian Far East. He is the author of several books and have received grants and awards from ACLS, the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. His presentation today is entitled Dungan Folktales and Legends, the Sino-Muslim Folkloric Narrative Tradition of Central Asia. Please go ahead, Kenneth.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So I'm going to share my slides here. Let me know if you can see the slides. Yes? Okay.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
As Zohar said, I'll be talking about Dungan Folktales and Legends, the Sino-Muslim Folkloric narrative tradition of Central Asia. And this is based on research that appears in my recent publication by the same name, Dungan Folktales and Legends, which was published by Peter Lang in its International Folkloristic Series, volume 16 in 2021. So first, I'd like to briefly discuss the significance of the study of the Dungan folkloric narrative tradition. So first, there is the existence of tale types not found in other folkloric traditions. Second, it is the basis for the development of Dungan written literature in the Soviet period. And third, it provides evidence for the complex ethnogenesis of the Dungan or Hui people, who are the Sinophone or Chinese-speaking Muslims in Central Asia and China, respectively. So a few introductory comments about who the Dungan people are. So the Dungans are descendants of, as I said, Sinophone Muslims or Hui, who first crossed from Northwest China into Russian Central Asia after the suppression of the Dungan Revolt, which lasted from 1862 to 1877 under the Manchu-led Qing dynasty. So most of the original Dungan settlers were poor, illiterate peasants or small urban craftsmen who had come from Turpan in Xinjiang, from Gansu province, and from Shanxi province in China. By tradition, the Dungans are Sunni Muslims of the Hanafi school, like most of their Central Asian neighbors. The Dungans have traditionally had large families, often with between 6 and 8 children, and they enjoy a reputation as a hardworking and prosperous people. And much of this information comes from Svetlana Rimsky-Korsakov-Dyer, one of her monographs published in 1992. So according to the latest census data available as of 2020, there are an estimated 150,000 Dungans, and this is the figure that I give in my book. The Dungans live primarily in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Eastern Uzbekistan. Now I'd like to introduce the 3 co-authors of the volume that I translated, and who also conducted a study that I'll be talking about, general features of the Dungan tales. So the lead researcher is the editor of the classic Russian language study, Boris Lvovich Rivtin, who lived from 1932 to 2012. He is considered a pioneer in the study of Chinese popular literature, folklore, and visual culture. He was a doctor of philological sciences and was, in fact, known to many as Li Fuqing by his Chinese name, because he was so good in Chinese that he actually authored several publications in Chinese. The second co-author of the edition and also translator of the folk tales from Dungan into Russian is Mahmoud Akhmedovich Hassanov, who lived from 1932 to 1977. He was a Dungan writer, literary scholar, and candidate of philological sciences. And he is considered a leading expert in Dungan folklore, as well as he was an influential Soviet Dungan prose writer of the 1960s and the 1970s. Finally, the third co-author of the classic Russian study and collaborator on the research study is Ilyas Ismailovich Yusupov, who lived from 1930 until 2005. He was a Dungan historian and candidate of historical sciences, and he was also a prolific researcher in Dungan history and philology, who published more than 100 scholarly works during his lifetime. Just a few remarks about these, the classic Russian language study, which appeared under the title Duganskie Narodnie Сказки и Предания, Dungan Folktales and Legends in 1977. So this is a collection of 78 Dungan folk stories translated into Russian by Riftin, Hassanov, and Yusupov. It was under the general editorship of Riftin and includes a scholarly introduction and analysis by Riftin and Hassanov. So it was published in 1977, as I said, by Nauka Publishers in Moscow as part of its series titled Tales and Myths of Eastern Peoples, and received quite a bit of attention at the time because of its inclusion in the series. Now I'd like to move to the discussion of the in-depth structural and comparative analysis of the Dungan folk tales conducted by Riftin, Hassanov, and Yusupov. So the 78 folk narratives that serve as the basis for the study appear in their entirety and are organized according to the Arne Thompson Tale Type Index in both the first Russian language edition, which came out in 1977, and my own English language edition, which came out in 2021. So the findings indicate that Dungan folk stories are firmly rooted in Chinese storytelling traditions, but also exhibit substantial Middle Eastern, East Asian, and Central Asian influence. So briefly, I'd just like to go through the three major chapters or sections in terms of how these tales are organized, both in the classic Russian language edition as well as in my English language edition. So the largest grouping of the tales of the three is what's called a wonder tales and animal tales. And here we have the largest number of selections, 40. And you can see on the Zoom screen now, the first selections. Here are the next points. Okay. The second grouping of the tales is called novelistic tales, folk anecdotes, and adventure stories. And this comprises 27 of the 78 stories in the collection. And finally, the third section or chapter is legends, historical tales, and narratives, which comprise 11 selections, many of which are in fact, the longer selections in the collection. Okay, so now I'd like to briefly discuss 8 general features of the Dungan folk narratives that have been identified in the study published in 1977 and in translation with Riftin as the lead researcher and editor. So the first feature is tale typology. So generally speaking, the Dungan folk tales can be categorized into 2 major types. So basically the shorter and then the longer folk tales. So the shorter being the Gujie, typical folk tales, and then what's called in Dungan Fo, which can be compared with Beijing Shuoshu or storytelling to music, which are literally book stories or those with a basis in the Chinese literary tradition. The second feature is origins of these Dungan folk narratives. So there are both Far Eastern and Near Eastern sources for the tales, which reflects the complex ethnogenetic and cultural ties of the Dungan. There's also a down-to-earth nature of the fiction of the Dungan tale, especially a wonder tale, and this links it to the folklore of Far Eastern peoples. So the action in Dungan tales, as for instance in Chinese tales, takes place not in some distant and unknown realm, a land of fantasy, but rather all the uncommon occurrences happen with the hero or protagonist nearby, in places native and familiar to the storyteller. Third, I'd like to just briefly discuss narrative time. So there is a general lack of localization in time in the Dungan stories, which usually attribute the action to an indefinite past time. And this is a contrast to the tales of a number of peoples of the Far East, for example, the Chinese and Koreans, who are generally inclined toward legend or tradition, which often specifically will indicate the time of the action. Fourth, I'd like to make a few comments about physical landscape. So very often there is the mention of frightening and dangerous mountains. Interestingly, however, there is no mention of the frightful forest, which we see so commonly in European tales. There is also mention of the plain, which is usually inferred in the Dungan tales rather than specifically described. And then we also have mention of the sea, but interestingly, no lakes or rivers. And so, for example, the East China Sea is one that is often mentioned, and that is where the Dragon King, or in Dungan, Lunwan, dwells. And then there is a mention of cities as well. And when a city is mentioned in a Dungan tale, it's usually, however, an abstract, quaint Chinese city rather than a specifically named one. Fifth, I'd like to make a few comments about the common character types in the Dungan tales. So in these tales, we see farmers, shepherds, petty traders, woodcutters, hunters, keepers of coaching inns, bandits, officials, and sovereigns. Then there is also mention of various types of immortals. For example, Shen Xia, immortal genius in Taoist mythology, or the holy Hizir, whose depiction is typical in Near Eastern and Central Asian folklore. And then, of course, we have fantastical characters. So among the many fantastical characters are those linked variously with Far Eastern mythology, Central Asian folklore, the Near Eastern and Middle Eastern mythological sphere, Indo-Buddhist mythological religious beliefs, and Turkic folklore. And then finally, there is, we also see familial relations in the Dungan tales, and exemplifying the idea of filial piety and punishment for undutiful children. And this has been mainstreamed under the influence of Confucianism. Six, I'd like to make a few comments about individual motifs and plots. So there is the depiction of the societal relations of old China in modified forms in the Dungan tales. So for example, heroes encountering officials or emperors who seem closer to the common people than in the tales of the Chinese. Then there is also frequent reference to two kingdoms and two sovereigns, respectively. And this is possibly preserving memories of the periods of temporary fragmentation in China in the Middle Ages, or memories of ancient tribal chiefs or clan leaders in the south of China, or simply the borrowing of plots from the folklore of neighboring non-Far Eastern peoples, presumably mainly Turkic peoples. And then there is also the infrequent appearance of the ahun, which is a word of Persian origin, and it denotes a Muslim clergyman or mullah, whose depiction is never found in Chinese folklore or Far Eastern folklore generally. And then there are folklore characters of neighboring peoples readily entering the world of the Dungan tale. For example, lamas, Buddhist monks, and Taoist monks. Finally, I'd like to make just a few comments about symbolism. So first, color symbolism. So red and green are seen as bright colors, scaring away evil spirits and protecting from adversity. White is the color of mourning among the Dungans, as well as among the Chinese. White is also associated with fantastical animals that typically help the hero or the protagonist. Black is mainly applied to negative characters and phenomena. Yellow is a color portending doom, and blue and the closely related green are associated commonly with dark forces. Okay? And eighth and finally, I just two comments on number symbolism. So the numbers that are very often mentioned in the Dungan tales are 3, 7, 72, and 9, and its derivatives, especially 99. And then 40 is a number occupying a special place in Dungan folklore, apparently entering it from the Near Eastern cultural tradition. So here you may recall the Near Eastern tale, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, and the Dungan version, Stories of 40 Viziers. Okay. So, the references that I've used in my PowerPoint presentation today are Svetlana Rimsky-Korskov-Dyer, as I mentioned, of course, Boris Erivtsin, and myself. And if you'd like to contact me for any reason after the presentation today, please feel free to email me at kyin@legcc.cuny.edu or visit my professional website at kjy.georgetown.edu. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Yin. Really appreciate it. And this has been exciting to not only see your latest contribution to the field, but also to have the opportunity to engage with you directly. So